I am delighted to invite our first speaker to the camera. Let me introduce her as she's coming in. Professor Amandine Catala. Amandine is, and I have to read this out because it's an extremely interesting and impressive chair. Amandine is Canada Research Chair on Epistemic Injustice and Agency, the Department of Philosophy at University of Quebec in Montreal. And as far as I know, I don't think there's another chair on epistemic injustice in the world. So this is really a memorable appointment. Amandine is a social and political philosopher, a feminist philosopher, and epistemologist, works on philosophy of race and disability. And very excitingly, she has a book coming out in next year, sometime next year, with Oxford University Press, on the dynamics of epistemic injustice, situating epistemic power and agency. And Amandine's talk today is identifying principles of justice for emancipatory research with autistics. And so I think, Amandine, you want to share your screen with us. So go ahead, and Amandine will talk for about 30 minutes and we'll have Q&A after that. So over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe, for introducing me and for hosting the conference this year. And of course, to Shelley and Jamie for organizing and logistical support and everything. So before I start, I do want to remind everyone of the possibility of turning on the captions at the bottom of your screen, just like Joe mentioned a moment ago. And I will also give a visual description of myself. So I'm a white woman with long brown hair. I'm wearing round glasses and a light cream sweater, and behind me is a plain beige background. I would also like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the University of Quebec at Montreal, and that this university is located on unceded Indigenous lands. I recognize the Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk Nation as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So now for my presentation, I think you may have heard the slogan of the neurodiversity movement, who has long advocated for nothing about us without us. And that's in this particular context that I'm going to be focusing on today, the necessity of including autistics in the production of public policy, social discourses, academic knowledge, and scientific research about autism. Similarly, the scientific and academic community is increasingly recognizing the importance for participatory research to be not only ethical, but also emancipatory. Yet this call for nothing about us without us is still too often ignored, inaccurately understood, or imperfectly applied in ways that can be jarring and disrespectful at best, and violent and traumatic at worst. And I think this obviously significantly undermines both the ethical requirement and the emancipatory potential of participatory research. So I think that if participatory autism research is to be conducted both ethically and in an emancipatory manner that heeds the call for nothing about us without us, then it's urgent to identify specific principles that allow us to effectively bridge the gap between emancipation and this call for nothing about us without us. And what I'm going to be suggesting today is that beyond a call for formal inclusion, the call for nothing about us without us is first and foremost a call to reclaim epistemic authority and agency. So my approach for today will be to draw on my experience as an autistic woman, academic, and self-advocate who has also participated in studies on autism in order to develop a proposal for how the principle of nothing about us without us might best be implemented in research with autistics. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to be turning to two frameworks that have so far been developed independently of each other, but that prove to be particularly fruitful, I think, when we use them together. And so that's the framework of design justice and epistemic injustice. And based on these two frameworks, I'm going to propose 4 principles of justice for participatory and emancipatory research. So those 4 principles are the principle of thorough involvement, of non-normative communication, of trust building, and of accountability. And of course, I will go through them one by one during the talk, but I want to start with just a few definitions just to make sure we're on the same page for some key terms. I'll be referring throughout the talk to neuronormativity, which I've defined with some colleagues as the prevalent neurotypical set of assumptions, norms, and practices that construes neurotypicality as the sole acceptable or superior mode of cognition, and that stigmatizes attitudes, behaviors, or actions that reflect neuroatypical modes of cognition as deviant or inferior. And neuronormative assumptions, norms, and practices uphold standards regarding, for example, what's neurotypically considered appropriate eye contact, facial expressions, prosody, conversational flow, processing, and responsiveness, all of which can be difficult for autistic individuals to understand, sense, or apply due to neurocognitive differences. Also, wanting to briefly come back to neurodiversity, and it can refer either to a natural fact or to a socio-political movement. So as a natural fact, neurodiversity is simply a part of biodiversity. It refers to the range of neurocognitive variation that is naturally present across the human population. Just a quick note to say that because of this, really, neurodiverse is an adjective for communities rather than individuals. As a socio-political movement, the neurodiversity movement advocates for the equal recognition and inclusion of the various types of neurocognitive profiles that make up neurodiversity throughout humanity. And so in this sense, the neurodiversity movement fundamentally aims to resist and dismantle neuronormativity or the socially constructed hierarchization among naturally occurring variations in neurocognitive profiles. So I think it's interesting to notice the parallels with other systems of oppression like sexism or racism, where again, physical characteristics like reproductive organs or skin color or are then socially read and hierarchized according to basically various power relations at play in society. So as I said, I'm going to be drawing from 2 frameworks here, and I'm going to start now from the framework of design justice and then turn to epistemic injustice afterward. So according to design justice, the process of designing objects and environments must include the principal stakeholders, namely the people who will use these objects or environments. So my idea here is just to extend design justice to autism research, where the relevant stakeholders are the people whom the studies are about, namely autistics. And design justice stipulates that stakeholders should be involved at every stage of the design process, from the very beginning to the very end. And another reason that I think design justice is helpful here is that it offers a terminology and a taxonomy that allows us to name and identify the various types of harm that can result from the failure to apply principles of design justice. And that's the concepts of affordances and disaffordances, and then 2 subtypes of disaffordances, which are disaffordances with a Y and then misaffordances. So apologies for the jargon, but I do think they are actually turn out to be quite helpful. And of course, I'm going to define them now. So affordances and disaffordances are terms that are due to ecological psychologist Gibson. And in 1979, he defined them as factors or features of the environment that respectively enable or disable agency for a given individual. So if you think of stairs, for example, those are going to allow you to move between the levels of a built structure, but of course, only if you have the kind of body or physical capacities that make it possible for you to do that. You know, if you are someone who's using a wheelchair, or if you're a teeny tiny little wobbly toddler, stairs are not going to allow you to move in between levels. And in that sense, they are not going to be an affordance for you. They're actually going to be a disaffordance for you. By contrast, elevators will allow anybody, regardless of their physical capacity and things like that, to move in between levels of a building. So in that sense, an elevator would provide an affordance for anyone irrespective of their social group membership. So what I think is interesting to notice here is the relational character of affordances and disaffordances. They really track the relation between an individual as situated in a particular environment and the opportunities this environment affords this individual given their particular position in this environment. And read in a feminist or emancipatory light, the relational character of affordances and disaffordances also points to their potentially political character. Because a social environment that's structured by unequal power relations will, of course, produce differential affordances and disaffordances for individuals in virtue of their social position. So, in other words, not only do some features of the environment provide affordances or disaffordances for some people, that's the relational aspect, but the exact same features of the environment that provide affordances for some will provide disaffordances for others, and that's the political aspect. And you can think of stairs, for example, here, right? So it's affording movement for some people who are socially situated in such a way, but disaffordances for others who are differently positioned. And so read in this feminist or emancipatory light, the analytical tool of affordance or disaffordance can also be a critical tool, one that highlights power differentials that enable agency for some by affording them certain opportunities, while disabling agency for others by denying them these same opportunities. So with this critical lens in mind, we can now turn to two further related concepts, which are, like I said, subtypes of disaffordance with an I, and those two concepts are disaffordance with a Y and misaffordance. So disaffordance with a Y is something that arises when environmental factors force individuals to misidentify themselves in order to fit into a pre-existing mold or template that does not match or welcome their identity, in order to be able to make use of a feature or to take advantage of an opportunity offered by the social environment. So an example here would be most restrooms and administrative forms for non-binary people, which usually force us to force non-binary people in general, including non-binary people, to choose male or female, for example, in the binary options, and either for using the restrooms or for taking advantage of a service that requires filling out a form. So that's the example for disaffordance with a Y. Now, turning to the concept of misaffordance, misaffordance is something that arises when environmental factors are supposed to offer individuals useful or beneficial opportunities that in fact end up being useless or harmful to them. And I think here a lot of EDI, so equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, which have become hugely popular, including at academia, tend to, I think, produce misaffordances. So there's a claim to be helping minorities by including us, but then it's often according to a model of add minorities and stir. So it's basically demographic representation, but nothing actually changes in the environments and the practices. And so that's actually quite harmful to people who are differently positioned, and yet are part of these environments that still function in dominant ways, basically. So drawing on the terminology and taxonomy of design justice, now I would like to argue that avoiding these harms and effectively implementing design justice in the context of autism research requires involving autistics with regard not only to the content, but also to the form of the study. And of course, even though I'll be referring to autistics and researchers, it is, of course, two categories that can also intersect. So there could also be autistic researchers. So with respect to the content of the study, I would like to propose the principle of thorough involvement. And the idea here is that autistics should be involved in identifying research priorities, conceiving and partaking in the study, and interpreting and disseminating the results. So let's look at each of them in turn. The principle of thorough involvement, first, in terms of the identification of research priorities, I think in general, research priorities, when they're established without consulting autistics, they include very often neuronormative interventions instead of autistic well-being and flourishing. So a really big one here is ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, which is considered the gold standard treatment, quote unquote, for autism. And it essentially consists in conversion therapy for autistics. And they actually have the same notorious creator, Ivar Lovaas, who's a Norwegian American psychiatrist. Yes, basically the idea of ABA, so it's a behaviorist approach, it aims to treat quote unquote autistic traits in order to make autistics appear more like neurotypicals via a system of rewards and punishments. So you'll be rewarded if you make eye contact, but you'll be punished if you flap, for example. And flapping for many autistics, including children who are going through these therapies, is a way often to not just express emotions, but also self-regulate emotions. And it's perfectly harmless. It may look odd to people who don't know what it is or what it does, but it's very helpful to the person. And so basically forcing a person to fit into this neuronormative mold through ABA essentially makes ABA what I've called before a disaffordance with a Y, because it forces people to conform to this mold that by definition is not made for autistics. And again, all that does is sort of promote neurotypical appearance, but not at all autistic well-being. There's a lot of trauma that results from people who go through these therapies, much like we know that it was the case for conversion therapies related to sexual orientation or gender expression. And the same is true here in the case of neurocognitive profiles. Okay, so I also said that the principle of thorough involvement is not just about establishing research priorities, but also the formulation of questions that will be used. And this is important in order to avoid inappropriate or irrelevant questions, for example, asking for greater detail about traumatic parts of participants' lives, because this type of question, intrusive and invasive, effectively creates a misaffordance for autistics, because a study that's meant to help them, in fact, ends up being harmful to them. And then the principle of thorough involvement, finally, also, I think, requires involving autistics in the interpretation and dissemination of results to reduce the likelihood of disaffordances and misaffordances. I think that leaving autistics out of these research stages altogether would create a disaffordance by ignoring them as relevant contributors or interlocutors. And it would also create a misaffordance by formally including autistics in the study, but harming them by propagating claims that blithely ignore their perspectives and needs, which is harmful to autistics. Now, with respect to the form of the study, I'd like to suggest a principle of non-normative communication. The idea here is that autistics should be involved in determining the modalities of communication and interaction that'll be employed throughout the study. For example, whether communication will take place synchronously or asynchronously, in person or online, orally or in writing, verbally or otherwise, and then also the pace of interactions and the frequency of exchanges. So that's to avoid generating a problem of disaffordance with a Y, where again, it would force autistic participants to fit into a neuronormative communicative mold while ignoring or dismissing our communicative needs, which of course, as autistics are often different from those of neurotypicals. Okay, so I think from what I've said, you can kind of catch a glimpse of why design justice, I think, provides a potentially promising avenue to heed the principle of nothing about us without us. I do think that in order for that potential to be realized with design justice, we must ensure that autistics will be taken seriously as research partners and contributors. And so that's where I turn to the framework of epistemic injustice. So as you may know, epistemic injustice, abbreviated here as EI, arises when a person is not taken seriously as someone who can contribute knowledge, provide relevant information, and understand or interpret their own experience. Specifically, it arises when a person is not adequately believed or understood because they belong to a marginalized or minoritized group. And more precisely, because of either individual and or societal biases that affect the lack of credibility and intelligibility that these groups face. And I will go now through common pitfalls that arise in autism research, and then show how they produce various types of epistemic injustice. And there were 7 of them that I could identify. So let's look at this now. Okay, so a very common pitfall in autism research working with autistic participants is to use insulting or stigmatizing terms. So we have a lot of terms like disorder, deficits, deficiency, risk of autism, suffers from autism, affected by autism, must fix autism, find a cure for autism, intervene in autism. All of these things, I think, are problematic. They create first hermeneutical injustice, because hermeneutical injustice is not just about a lack of concept, but also about alternative descriptions that fill a certain gap, and then also a lack of circulation or recognition of more adequate concepts. So, for example, if we take the well-known example of sexual harassment, the problem was not just that the concept of sexual harassment was missing at a certain point in history, but it's also that it was replaced by this alternative description of harmless flirting. That was also a problem here. And similarly here, even though the neurodiversity movement has come up with a lot of ways of construing and talking about autism in a much more inclusive way, there's really a lack of circulation or recognition of these more adequate ways of speaking about autism. And so that means that very often our experience and realities as autistics remain misunderstood. So that's for how stigmatizing language creates hermeneutical injustice, but it also creates testimonial injustice, because of course, if we're going to be misrepresenting autistics as deficient human beings and communicators who lack, pick your stereotype, social motivations, theory of mind, humor, and empathy, that's going to create all these, like I said, social stereotypes and individual prejudices about autistics, which often translate into unduly diminished credibility levels. And that's exactly what testimonial injustice is. Okay, so another pitfall in autism research is the imposition of communication modalities during this study. So whether we're talking about the format, synchronicity, frequency, and all that, that's basically imposed on autistic participants. That I think also creates further epistemic injustice. So here in particular, I think this imposition stems from testimonial quieting, and this is a term by Christy Dodson, and it's basically the idea that autistics, in this case, are not even consulted on the matter, right? So not even perceived as people who might have something interesting to say about communication modalities in this case. And then I think it might also stem from what I've called elsewhere meta-epistemic injustice, which is a prior epistemic injustice that arises at the methodological level rather than in any specific epistemic exchange. And when allistic, meaning non-autistic researchers neuronormatively determine or assume what counts as appropriate communication modalities when producing or exchanging knowledge in the context of a study. So meta-epistemic injustice is basically, yes, an epistemic injustice regarding the very way we define those concepts that, like epistemic injustice and agency, and what counts as knowledge and valid communication, including communication modalities. So that's the idea here. Okay, another pitfall in autism research is rejecting alternative communication modalities. So basically here, I think we are faced with a further problem of testimonial injustice because we're dismissing autistics' alternative suggestions due to neuronormative biases. And very often we'll be told, well, it doesn't work, or it's not the proper way to do it, or like many different reasons are cited against taking up our suggestions. I also think it creates what Nora Bernstein has called epistemic exploitations, because autistics are prompted to, quote, not hesitate to communicate any of your needs or preferences. But then when we do, then it's just dismissed for, again, neuronormative reasons, even though we've taken the time and energy to explain our preferred communicative modalities. I think that epistemic exploitation also arises when allistic researchers insist on asking further details about difficult experiences. So here, basically, autistics are asked to perform intensive cognitive, psychological, and emotional labor, which comes with considerable opportunity costs. While we're busy doing that and recovering from doing that, we're not able to devote our time and energies to our own project. And also, there is no guarantee of uptake or understanding, let alone any real change or transformation in the neuronormative systems that lead to these difficult experiences for autistics. And these are all definitional features of epistemic exploitation, according to Bernstein. Okay. Another pitfall is this failure on the part of researchers to check or to even better co-produce the interpretation of results with autistics. So I think this creates a problem of what Linda Alcoff has called epistemic extractivism. Now, she looks at it in the market context of capitalism, where lands and peoples are viewed first and foremost as resources toward ever greater profit. So obviously it's not exactly what I'm talking about here, although there is also a whole autism industrial complex where that could also be arguably applied. But here what I want to do is to extend this concept of extractivism to the epistemic context of scientific or academic research, where extractivist approaches aim at ever greater scientific or academic profit in the form of publications, funding, and promotion, regardless of the needs, interests, or claims made by the population whose knowledge is being extracted, in this case, autistics. And then I also think that this failure to check results with participants creates what Emelon Davis has termed epistemic appropriation, which she defines as occurring via two different mechanisms. The first is what she calls epistemic detachment. That's where the source of the knowledge that's obtained and used by the researchers is not appropriately credited. So participants basically are not appropriately credited in the study. And then that first step of epistemic detachment is then followed by epistemic misdirection. And that's the idea that researchers are going to be receiving publications, grants, promotions, other accolades, while the living material or symbolic conditions of their subjects will remain unchanged. So obviously a very common problem in human and social sciences. Okay, and then I think another pitfall in autism research is this failure to share research results even after their publication, because often they're behind paywalls, and then even if they're not, they're often in inaccessible scientific jargon that's not accessible to most lay people. This failure to share might be either with the autistic participants in the actual study or with the larger autistic community. And I think that creates testimonial quieting again, this idea that autistics are not viewed as relevant interlocutors, and again, epistemic extraction and appropriation for the same reasons as I just mentioned. So very final a type of pitfall is that as a result of sort of undergoing all these sorts of poor treatment in interactions with holistic researchers, autistics might decide to stop participating in projects, whether studies, it could also be research groups, panels, or committees that do not take our neurocognitive profile into account when soliciting or interacting with us. And that creates what Christy Dodson has called epistemic smothering, which is when a potential speaker refrains from engaging with a particular audience on a particular subject because they know from experience that they will not be taken seriously or treated as an epistemic equal. And so when you've had so many sort of poor experiences, you just think, well, it's no longer worth my time or energy. It's not going to change anything anyway. And so you sort of give up basically, not because of yourself, but really because of the neuronormative biases that are at play in the situation. Okay, and then so this, I'm reaching the end here, don't worry. Just to say very quickly to finish, so that there's two more principles that I would like to introduce. So when I talked about the framework of design justice in the first part of the talk, I introduced the principle of thorough involvement for the study that autistics should be involved at every stage. I also introduced the principle of non-normative communication. Those were the first two principles. And in here, I think that having reviewed these various pitfalls that arise in the context of autism research, like all these types of epistemic injustice that arise in autism research, I think we can avoid them by applying the last two, the next two and final two principles for this talk today. The principle of trust building between autistics and researchers, and the principle of accountability for researchers. So here is how I sort of imagine them. So in terms of the principle of trust building between autistics and researchers, the idea here is to really be careful about using respectful language, inclusive communication modalities, also having a form of transparency with respect to funders and a guarantee of involvement in the interpretation and dissemination of results, also responsiveness to the contributions, needs, and concerns of autistics. I think this idea of responsiveness to people is to participants' perspectives is very important in this trust building process. And then there is also the principle of accountability for researchers that I think should be introduced as the fourth principle of justice. And I think this principle of accountability might be enforced, for example, via institutional research ethics boards. So the people committees that approve a study moving forward when it involves participants. Also might be involved via funding agencies, maybe also editors and publishers who might double check whether the language used and the methodology that's adopted is inclusive. Okay, so to conclude, my starting point was to ask how we might bridge the call for the neurodiversity movement, the call of the neurodiversity movement for Nothing About Us Without Us with the emancipatory turn in participatory research. To that question, I've proposed to turn to two frameworks, the framework of design justice and the framework of epistemic justice. And I've argued for 4 principles, which I do want to stress in closing, maybe are, I think, necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. So they don't need to be presented as or understood as exhaustive principles. And those 4 principles are the principle of thorough involvement, the principle of non-normative communication, the principle of trust building, and the principle of accountability. And thank you for your attention. And I'll stop sharing my screen. There you go.
Well, thank you so much, Amandine. And I see, sorry, I'm slightly distracted by these hands of approval.
Thank you, everyone.
Appearing on the screen there. So very, very rich and fertile presentation. I have so many questions myself, but I will restrain myself because they're already appearing in the Q&A. So Amandine, you might want to look at them in the Q&A, but I will read them out anyway.
Great.
And the first 2, we're very honored to have Hypatia of SFAR with us as a guest. And the first question is, I have basically 2 questions at this point. We'll take the first one first off. How can terms like affordance, disaffordance, etc., be applied that do reference connections, disconnections to groups, as it is, if I understand it, as a sociological term, when I in principle have no or very little connection to those groups? Or is this disconnection a reflexive circular kind of disaffordance? So as I take it, the question is saying, is it assumed that affordance, disaffordance is about groups? And do I have to identify as a member of that group in order for this analysis to apply to me? So I apologize if I misunderstood it, but that's how I'm reading the question.
Okay, thank you for the question. And thanks also, Joe, for, I wasn't quite sure, but that's helpful what you just said. I think I understand that. So yes, originally the concept of affordance and disaffordance is actually not necessarily a political concept. So no, it doesn't necessarily have to do with social group membership. So originally it's a purely sort of descriptive thing, and it really doesn't even have to be, it can be very individually directed, right? So for example, if you are training as a climber, for example, as someone who climbs walls or mountains, as you develop your skills, different salient or different features of the environment will become salient to you, and you'll be like, oh, I could like stick my, my hand in there, or my toe or something. And so that's basically picking up on affordances of the environment. And it's a very sort of depoliticized example in this case. I mean, and so, yes, my idea here was because when I came to these concepts, I already had all of this feminist sort of critical background in mind. And so for me, I was immediately reading them as like, oh, well, there's so much potential in terms of, critical potential here. And so, yes, I think that you can really use at basis, you can really use affordances and disaffordances in a very non-political way. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's simply that I like to say that I think it's very helpful to understand them in this political way, because I think they really show a lot of the problems that we have in oppressive systems of oppression. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for the answer. And what I will do is take Luana's first question now. I'll come back to Hypatia's second question. So Luana's first question: we in the autistic community that articulate around the neurodiversity banner and are deemed to be with lower demands of support are often accused of not considering autistics with higher demands of support. This is quite relevant for inclusion and representativeness in research, as neurodiversity could end up favoring over representativeness of us, the ones with verbal communication with low demands for support, thus reinforcing epistemic injustice against the ones that the Lancet Commission framed as having profound autism. How would your framework reply to this? I suppose it's a type of intersectionality within autism research.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a great question, a very important one. And so thank you for asking it. And yes, absolutely, you're right. We have to be very careful that whoever is included in autism research is representative of the very different kinds of groups and intersectionalities and positionalities that are also basically affected by the realities of autism. So yes, absolutely. I think that's something to pay attention to on the part of researchers. And I also think it might be something that perhaps something like the principle of accountability or the principle of trust building would require, right? Because I think there's basically interesting situations where if you have institutions, and in this case, it would be a scientific or academic institution of research on autism, that doesn't basically sort of foster or pay attention to the needs and perspectives of certain communities. And here it could be certain portions of the autistic community in particular, let's say racialized or global South autistics, then yes, absolutely, that would be, I think, a good reason for the autistic community not to trust necessarily the research that's produced. And so I think that if we responded by asking for this sort of better representation and if that could be guaranteed by the principle of accountability, principle of trust building, hopefully that would then, like I said, foster the kind of trust and accountability that would make it possible to include these perspectives. Now, I think, we don't necessarily need to have in the same study all of the perspectives, because it's possible that not actually, depending on what the study is about, not everybody will have but definitely overall, we want to have sort of a research landscape on autism that's inclusive of all the perspectives and interests. Absolutely. I think that's true. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm going to take now Roman Irvin's question, which is at the bottom. I'm partly doing that because it overlaps with one of the questions I wanted to ask. So I'll expand on it a little bit. So Roman says, do you think nothing about us without us applies broadly to other groups of people? What about in cases, e.g. children or other groups where they may not have a perfect epistemic position? And the reason that links to one of the things I was thinking about was particularly towards the end, a lot of, you mentioned other social science researchers having to deal with similar problems. And I think particularly in anthropology, the issues about exploitative research practices, people advancing their careers through exploring people that they're not helping. These have been thoroughly discussed in those disciplines. So I wondered if there are distinctive factors that arise in relation to autistics, or whether there's a type of comparison between your research and the methodological research that has been sort of almost crippling anthropology for quite a long time now.
Yeah. No, I think you're probably right, Jonathan, to say here I was focusing on the context of autism research because that's what I was more better positioned to talk about and more experienced with. But I think you're absolutely right that this dynamic might arise in any sort of context where there's a power differential between a researcher and a research subject or research community. And I think absolutely. So I was thinking also, of course, in the context of psychology or psychiatry research, that'll be also happening across other sort of, minoritized minds categories. But I also think you're right that even in anthropology and sort of other social groups at large, that could also be the case. So absolutely, I didn't mean to imply it was specific, but no, I think you're right. We might find that again in across other contexts. And then to Roman's point, so about the yes, I think that's right, that it will apply to other groups of people. The particular case of children, I actually think probably children, I don't know that anybody ever has a perfect epistemic position. And I also think children tend to probably know and understand more than we think they do. And I also have a very like broad understanding of knowledge and epistemic agency. And so I actually think, yeah, depending on how you define those things, I think children would be epistemic agents and would actually have interesting things to contribute. And I think there are a lot of interesting issues also of consent that arise in the context of children. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we're in the fortunate and unfortunate position of being overwhelmed with questions at the moment. We'll just take a few more before we have to stop in about 5, 6, 7 minutes. I take Sam Kalp's question now. It's also towards the bottom. How does design justice deal with intersectional situations, autistic folks who are racialized, working class, queer, and/or non-citizens? Is there problematic underrepresentation or hostile indifference of intersectional subgroups?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Again, thank you for the question. A big problem of intersectionality representation. I think there's, and I mean, I will say, like, even I'm in a very obviously privileged position. I'm a cis white woman. I have you know, job security, which is also not necessarily taken for granted or given for anybody in the community. But yes, absolutely. Like, I think you're right that racialized, working class, queer, other yeah, immigration status and all these things, all of these axes of intersectional positionality are going to obviously give very different answers to some of the questions we might be wondering about what it's like to be autistic, or what sort of needs or interests autistic people might have. So the idea of design justice though is precisely that, in a sense, right? It's so there is this great quote that says that design is a process whereby the politics of one world become imposed on another. You know, and so it's sort of like, even if you think about it, for example, like the way that we design like chairs or something, you know, like if you have chairs of a certain height or size or something, there's a lot of assumptions about the body that's going to fit or use the chair in that. And so once you have that and you impose it on everybody, like that's a problem. And so that's why I think design justice is exactly getting at that. It's sort of like this intersectionality. There is no like ideal, just like in philosophy, there's no ideal knower. In design justice, there's no ideal user. Like, we're all going to be differently sort of positioned and situated and have different needs. So yes, that's exactly the concern of design justice, actually. But you're right, though, that like when we are talking about relevant stakeholders, we need to be careful that we're not reintroducing sort of like, oh yeah, we checked with autistics, yes, but they were all like white and privileged and, you know, in various other ways. So yes, you're right that there's something we need to be careful about. But I think that design justice, by its very orientation and critical sort of approach, is concerned with these kinds of issues. I think it's equipped, at least in theory, to address that. Of course, in practice, we always have to be vigilant. But yeah, thank you.
I mean, and then you get the potential problem that something that works for one group may not work for another.
Absolutely. So, yes, absolutely.
So Amal Salmon has asked a huge question in a short sentence here. So I'm wondering how the two frameworks, design justice and epistemic justice, can be applied to disabilities more generally, and if you think there are specific aspects about them that apply better in certain situations than others. I don't know if there's something quickly you could say in reply.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, just super quick. So I think that definitely the two frameworks, I think for me, I find them very useful. I think we could even use them like in education, academia, sort of like talk to our students, including their various positionalities and intersectionalities. So take that into account to understand how we can better structure our academic environments, including our classrooms and our sort of methodological, pedagogical methods and things like that. But yes, I think the same is true for disability. I think it could, more generally, I just once again don't want to speak for you know, too many groups at once. I'm very glad if the framework can be used and helpful for other groups. But yes, again, like really, it's about sort of centering first-person perspectives and lived experience. For me, that's the key in design justice. And yes, that can be true across a range of things. And again, it doesn't have to be like a politicized context. I think it's very interesting in a politicized context, you know, but it's the same idea, once again, to take like the sort of politically neutral example of sports. I mean, to the extent that I'm using it, I think is politically neutral. I'm not saying sports are politically neutral, but in general, but here, like, so for example, you know, if you're sort of like, how should we design, I don't know, like, you know, a particular kind of sporting equipment, obviously you want to talk to people who are actually going to use it, right? If someone who's designing it has never practiced the sport, they'll have no idea how to design the equipment. So it's it's just sort of a basic, sort of ask the people, like ask the relevant, it's a novel idea. But yeah, there you go.
Okay, so I'm afraid this next one is going to have to be our last question. So apologies to those who have questions who haven't had a chance to raise them, but they will all be saved in the chat, and then perhaps panelists
Yes.
can reply afterwards. So we'll take Christoph's question now. Regarding the principle of non-normative communication, do you think communication can be purely non-normative, especially in diagnostic settings where would one draw the line between medical expertise and gaslighting? Or maybe you could take the broader question, is there really such a thing as non-normative communication?
Yeah, so I think that so it depends what you mean by that. So I guess what I mean by normative communication is when there is one particular way of communicating that's considered the way, the only way, and the obvious way, and the easy way. And I think that's problematic. So in that sense, I mean, you can of course always argue that the idea of what I've suggested here is just to agree on different norms or different modalities. But I think that's sort of the idea, is sort of, for me, when I speak about norms, it's sort of like this sort of superimposed expectation that's not necessarily a result of consultation with the relevant stakeholders. That's really what I meant to say. And I'm sorry, there's so many good questions and points that I can't address right away.
But as this is the first session, I feel I shouldn't set a bad example and let us run over. So I think we've hit exactly the right time. If I've got this right, 13:55 we end. It's just about there now. So I hope you all join me in thanking Amandine